Basements hold a strange kind of power, don't they? The air always feels heavier, the shadows seem deeper, and every creak or groan echoes in a way that makes your heart race. They're places where light struggles to reach, perfect hiding spots for forgotten things, or sometimes, things that shouldn't be remembered. Tonight, we're venturing into 3 truly disturbing basement horror stories, each one real, each one more chilling than the last. If you've ever hesitated before heading down those creaky wooden stairs, or felt your skin crawl at the thought of what might lurk just beyond the dim glow of the single bulb, this video might make you think twice about what's really down there. So turn off the lights, settle in, and get ready, because these stories aren't for the faint of heart. Our first story takes us to a quiet suburb where a young couple, Sarah and Michael, had just moved into their dream home. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids played outside, neighbors waved from their porches, and life felt predictably safe. The house was charming, with its ivy-covered brick walls and a front yard that practically begged for summer barbecues. But there was one part of the house they hadn't explored yet: the basement. From the moment they stepped through the door, there was something off about the place. Sarah couldn't explain it. It wasn't the musty smell or the old furniture left behind by the previous owners. It was something deeper, an unease that seemed to settle over her every time she stood at the top of the basement stairs. Michael laughed it off, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. But even he admitted there was a strange chill down there, colder than the rest of the house. One evening, while unpacking boxes, they decided to finally tackle the basement. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, they descended the creaking wooden steps. The air was damp, and the faint smell of mildew grew stronger with every step. At first glance, it seemed like a typical basement: unfinished walls, exposed pipes, and stacks of forgotten items from previous owners. But as they moved deeper into the space, Sarah noticed something unusual. In the far corner, behind an old bookshelf, was a small, locked door. It was no more than 4 feet tall, almost like it had been built for a child. Michael, always curious and a bit of a thrill-seeker, immediately began trying to pry it open, despite Sarah's protests. It took some effort, but eventually the rusty hinges gave way, and the door creaked open. What they found on the other side left them speechless. The space wasn't large, but it was carefully arranged. Old, dusty furniture was set up as if someone had been living there: an antique rocking chair, a small wooden table, and a child's doll sitting upright, staring blankly at them. The walls were covered in drawings, crude sketches of figures with hollow eyes and sharp, twisted smiles. And in the center of the floor was a ring of melted candles, their wax frozen in strange patterns that almost looked intentional. Sarah wanted to leave immediately, but Michael, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. Maybe the last owners used it as some kind of creepy playroom, he said, though even he couldn't hide the unease in his voice. They decided to leave everything untouched and sealed the door, vowing to deal with it later. But that night, as they lay in bed, Sarah swore she heard faint whispers coming from the basement, like someone softly calling her name. Michael assured her it was just the house settling, but as the days went on, the strange occurrences began to pile up. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the basement at odd hours. When Sarah finally convinced Michael to call the previous owners, their cryptic response only added to the dread. "You found the door, didn't you? Whatever you do, don't let it out." The line went dead, leaving Sarah and Michael with more questions than answers. What had they disturbed in their seemingly perfect home? And what would happen if it decided to come upstairs? The rest of the evening passed in a haze of unease. Sarah couldn't stop replaying the previous homeowner's words in her mind. Asterisk, don't let it out, asterisk, what did that mean? What could possibly be hidden behind that door, or in their basement, that would warrant such a warning? Michael, always the practical one, insisted they were overthinking it. "Probably just a prank," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence Sarah usually found so reassuring. Deep down, she could tell he was shaken too. even if he wouldn't admit it. That night, the house felt different, colder, quieter. Every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the pipes seemed louder, more deliberate. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it again, the faint whispering from below. It wasn't words exactly, but it was unmistakably a voice. Soft, distant, yet persistent. She nudged Michael awake, but by the time he sat up, the sound had stopped. "Sarah, you're stressing yourself out," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "There's nothing down there. Let's just get some sleep, okay?" She nodded, though she didn't believe him. As Michael drifted back to sleep, Sarah stayed awake, her ears straining for any hint of that eerie sound. When morning finally came, the first light of dawn brought little comfort. The basement was still there, and so were the unanswered questions it held. The next day, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. Michael was at work, and the house was eerily quiet. She stood at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight in hand, trying to summon the courage to go back down. Her heart pounded as she descended the steps, each one creaking under her weight. The basement was as she remembered it, cold, damp, and heavy with an unshakable sense of unease. She approached the small door cautiously, half expecting it to be ajar despite their efforts to seal it. To her relief, it was still closed, but the air around it felt different, heavier, like it was charged with static. She stared at the door, debating whether to open it again. Part of her wanted to leave it alone, to pretend they'd never found it. But another part of her, the part that couldn't ignore the whispering, needed answers. Before she could make up her mind, a sharp knock on the front door made her jump. She ran upstairs, her heart racing, and opened the door to find an elderly woman standing on the porch. She was small and hunched, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather bag. "Hello, dear," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I used to live in this house. I heard someone new had moved in, and I wanted to, well, I felt I should warn you about something." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Warn me about what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated, glancing past Sarah into the house as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Did you find the door?" she asked finally. Sarah felt her blood run cold. "We did," she said. "What's behind it?" The woman sighed, her shoulders sagging as if under the weight of a heavy burden. "Not what? Who?" she said. "We called him the Watcher, my husband, and I discovered that room not long after we moved in, just like you. At first, we thought it was nothing, just some creepy old storage space. But then, strange things started happening." Sarah motioned for the woman to come inside. They sat in the living room, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, a stark contrast to the darkness of their conversation. The woman explained that the drawings on the walls had been there when they found the room, along with the doll and the candles. They'd tried to get rid of the items, but no matter what they did, they always reappeared. And then there were the noises, the whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. "We tried to sell the house, but no one would buy it," the woman said, her voice shaking. "So we stayed, and we learned to live with it. As long as we left the door locked and never went back inside, the Watcher stayed quiet. But if we disturbed it," she trailed off, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. "That's when things got bad." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. "What kind of things?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I kept a journal," she said, handing it to Sarah. "Everything we experienced is in here. Maybe it will help you. But please listen to me. Don't open that door again." With that, the woman stood and made her way to the door. Sarah wanted to ask her more, to beg her to stay, but the look in the woman's eyes stopped her. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who had barely escaped with their sanity intact. After the woman left, Sarah sat in the living room, staring at the notebook. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to pretend none of this was happening. But another part of her, the part that couldn't ignore the weight of the woman's words, knew she had to read it. She opened the notebook and began to read. The entries started out mundane. Notes about the house, little quirks they'd discovered while settling in. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. The woman described hearing whispers, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever she was near the basement. She wrote about the watcher, how she and her husband had come to believe it was some kind of presence tied to the room behind the door. One entry, written in shaky handwriting, caught Sarah's attention. Asterisk, we made a mistake. We thought we could confront it, banish it, somehow, but now it's angry. The whispers are louder, the footsteps closer. Last night, I woke up to find the doll sitting at the foot of our bed, staring at me with those empty eyes. I don't know how much more we can take. Asterisk. Sarah slammed the notebook shut, her hands trembling. She felt a sudden urge to run, to get as far away from the house as possible. But where would she go? And what about Michael? He wouldn't believe her, not without proof. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Sarah made a decision. She had to tell Michael everything, about the woman, the notebook, and the warnings. But as she picked up her phone to call him, she froze. From the basement, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. Sarah froze, her hand gripping the phone so tightly it trembled. The footsteps were steady, deliberate, and impossibly clear. Her mind raced with every worst-case scenario. Someone had broken in, or worse, the watcher was no longer content to stay behind the door. The sound of each step echoed up the basement stairs, getting closer and closer, until she swore she'd feel the vibrations through the floor. She didn't dare move. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she strained to hear any other sounds. But then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. Silence filled the house like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. For a long moment, Sarah stayed frozen, staring at the basement door as if expecting it to burst open. The sudden jangle of her phone startled her so badly she nearly dropped it. Michael's name lit up the screen, his call snapping her out of her paralysis. She fumbled to answer. "Michael," she blurted, her voice trembling. "There's someone in the house. I heard footsteps, coming from the basement." Michael's response was immediate but calm, too calm for Sarah's liking. "Okay, listen to me. Get out of the house. Right now. I'll call the police." Sarah hesitated, glancing at the basement door again. Her fear was battling with something else, a strange, almost magnetic pull to stay, to know what was really happening. But Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. "Sarah, don't wait. Just go. I'll be there as soon as I can." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and grabbed her keys from the counter. As she backed toward the front door, her eyes remained fixed on the basement, half expecting it to swing open at any second. She stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting her like a wave of relief, and locked the door behind her. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, his car screeching to a stop in the driveway. Sarah was waiting in the front yard, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I called the cops," he said as he approached. "They'll be here soon. Are you okay?" She nodded, though her pale face and trembling hands told a different story. "It wasn't just footsteps, Michael," she said quietly. I think it's whatever was behind that door." Michael frowned, his jaw tightening. "Sarah, we don't even know what that is. For all we know, it could be some weird prank the old owners set up to scare people." "And what about the woman who showed up today? She said she lived here, Michael. She warned me not to open the door again. She gave me this." Sarah held up the notebook, her hands shaking. "She's terrified of whatever's in that room. And now I'm starting to understand why." Before Michael could respond, the wail of sirens broke the tensed silence. Two officers arrived and approached the couple with calm professionalism. Sarah explained what had happened as clearly as she could, though her voice wavered when she described the footsteps. Michael chimed in, adding that they had recently found a strange locked room in the basement. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them nodded. "Let's take a look," he said. Sarah hesitated, but Michael took her hand. "It'll be okay," he said, though she could feel the tension in his grip. Together, they followed the officers back into the house. The basement felt different this time, even colder and darker than Sarah remembered. The officers moved carefully, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. When they reached the small door, they paused. "This it?" one of them asked. Sarah nodded, her throat too dry to speak. The officer reached for the door handle, but Michael stopped him. "Wait," he said. "We sealed it after we found it. If it's unlocked now." The officer nodded, his expression turning serious. Slowly, he tried the handle. It didn't budge. "Still locked," he said. "Mind if I open it?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she managed a nod. The officer produced a set of tools and began working on the lock. The faint sound of metal scraping against metal filled the basement, each click making Sarah's anxiety rise. Finally, with a soft pop, the lock gave way. The door creaked open, revealing the small, eerie room beyond. It looked the same as before, the doll, the melted candles, the strange drawings on the walls. But there was something else now. The air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the room itself was alive. One of the officers stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the space. "Just looks like some old junk," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The second officer crouched down near the ring of melted candles, examining the floor. "Hold on," he said. This doesn't look right." He pointed to a faint, circular marking on the ground, almost like a rune, hidden beneath the wax. "What is it?" Michael asked. "Not sure," the officer said. "Could be some kind of..." Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed through the basement, making everyone jump. The sound came from the far side of the room, where a pile of old boxes had toppled over on their own. Sarah let out a small gasp, and even the officers looked uneasy. "We're going to do a full sweep of the house," one of them said quickly, motioning for everyone to head back upstairs. "Stay here while we check it out." Sarah and Michael waited in the living room, the tension thick between them. Neither spoke, but Sarah could see the worry etched on Michael's face. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the officers returned, their expressions unreadable. "We didn't find anyone," one of them said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "But if you're feeling unsafe, it might be a good idea to stay somewhere else for the night." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She packed a bag while Michael locked up the house. As they drove away, the dark silhouette of their home loomed behind them, its windows like empty, watching eyes. That night, they stayed at a nearby motel. Michael fell asleep quickly, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day. The watcher, the footsteps, the strange markings in the room. Just as she was beginning to drift off, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Groggily, she reached for it and frowned when she saw the notification. A motion alert from the security camera they'd set up in the basement a few weeks earlier. Her heart pounded as she opened the app. The video feed was grainy and dark, but she could just make out the faint outline of the basement. At first, it seemed empty, but then, from the corner of the frame, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shadow shifting against the far wall. And then, as Sarah watched in horror, the small door creaked open. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. The tiny door in the basement swung open slowly, the movement almost to liberate. Her fingers hovered over the phone, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. The shadow from the corner seemed to deepen, taking on a shape that wasn't entirely human. It stretched unnaturally long, rippling as if the darkness itself were alive. She tried to wake Michael, shaking his shoulder. "Michael, wake up. It's happening." The door opened. Michael groaned, turning over, but the urgency in her voice jolted him awake. "What? What are you talking about?" She shoved the phone into his hands, the video still playing. "Look," she whispered. "The basement. Something's down there." He squinted at the screen, his confusion quickly replaced by alarm as he watched the footage. The door had fully opened now, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness beyond. Then the shadow moved again, this time inching closer to the camera. It seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like a living thing. And then, without warning, the feed cut to static. Michael sat up, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But it came out of that room. For a long moment, they sat in stunned silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Finally, Michael stood. "We need to go back," he said. Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you crazy? We just saw whatever that was. We don't even know what we're dealing with." "That's exactly why we need to go," Michael said, his voice firm. "We can't just leave it there, Sarah. What if it's dangerous? What if it's not just the basement?" His words sent a chill down her spine. As much as she hated to admit it, he was right. If something truly unnatural was happening in their house, ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. Still, the thought of returning made her stomach churn. They left the motel just before dawn, the sky a dull gray as they drove back to the house. The streets were eerily empty, and the faint hum of the car engine was the only sound. Sarah clutched the notebook the old woman had given her, flipping through the pages for any clue, any warning they might have missed. One passage stood out, scribbled in the margins of an otherwise blank page. Asterisk, "It doesn't like to be ignored. The longer you leave it, the stronger it becomes." Asterisk. Her hands shook as she showed the note to Michael. "What if it's already too late?" she'd asked. He didn't answer, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. When they arrived at the house, everything looked normal, calm, still, almost deceptively welcoming. But as soon as they stepped inside, the oppressive feeling was back, stronger than before. The air felt thick, like walking through a heavy fog. Every instinct screamed at Sarah to turn around, to run, but she followed Michael as he headed toward the basement. The stairs creaked louder this time, each step echoing in the stillness. At the bottom, the small door stood ajar, just as they had seen in the video. Michael hesitated, glancing back at Sarah. "Stay here," he said. "Like hell I will," she shot back, though her voice wavered. Together, they approached the door. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the space. Michael pushed the door open wider, his flashlight piercing the darkness beyond. What they saw made Sarah's stomach drop. The room had changed. The furniture was gone, replaced by a crude circle etched into the floor, filled with symbols neither of them recognized. The walls were no longer covered in drawings, but in jagged scratches, as if someone, or something, had clawed at them. In the center of the room stood the doll, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its once lifeless eyes seemed to glint in the dim light, as if it were watching them. "Michael," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, "we shouldn't be here." Before he could respond, a low rumble echoed through the basement. The floor beneath their feet vibrated, the symbols in the circle beginning to glow faintly. The doll toppled over, landing face down in the center of the circle, and then the whispering started again. It was louder this time, more distinct, though the words were in a language neither of them understood. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them, suffocating them. Michael grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her back toward the stairs, but before they could move, the basement door slammed shut above them, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as Sarah fumbled for her phone, her trembling hands barely able to hold it steady. The flashlight tap flickered on, casting a weak beam of light across the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, writhing like living things. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were almost deafening. And then out of the corner of her eye, Sarah saw it. The shadow. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was there, moving toward them, its form shifting and twisting unnaturally. It didn't walk or crawl. It flowed, like liquid darkness spilling across the floor. "Run," Michael shouted, pulling her toward the stairs. They stumbled in the pitch-black room, the flashlight casting wild beams as they scrambled to escape. The shadow moved faster now, closing the distance between them. It reached out, tendrils of darkness stretching toward them like claws. As they reached the stairs, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to reverberate through the entire house. "You should not have come back." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. Michael shoved her up the stairs, his own fear evident as he glanced back at the approaching shadow. They reached the top, and Michael threw his weight against the basement door, forcing it open. They tumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing heavily, their ears straining for any sound. The house was silent, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Michael locked the door, his hands shaking. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. Sarah didn't argue. They grabbed what little they could carry and bolted for the car. As they drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. Whatever was in that basement wasn't just confined to the house anymore. It had followed them. The drive away from the house felt like a blur to Sarah. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy form trailing after them. Michael drove in tense silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The rising sun bathed the empty road in warm light, but it felt hollow, unable to chase away the chill that clung to them. They didn't have a destination, only a shared instinct to put as much distance as possible between them and that house. After what felt like hours, Michael finally spoke. "We need to figure out what this is," he said. "We can't keep running if we don't understand what we're dealing with." Sarah nodded, though she didn't know where to begin. The old woman's notebook was still in her lap, the pages flipping wildly as the wind from the cracked window caught them. She held it tighter, trying to make sense of the cryptic notes and frantic scrawls. One phrase kept jumping out at her. Asterisk, the watcher waits for the call to break the seal asterisk. What seal? She muttered to herself, tracing the words with her finger. Michael glanced at her. "What did you say?" Sarah turned the notebook toward him. "The seal. It keeps coming up. Do you think that's what the circle on the floor was? Some kind of barrier?" Michael frowned. "Maybe. But if that's true, why did it start breaking now? What changed?" Sarah thought back to the first night they had found the room. The lock, the door, the moment she had stepped inside. Her stomach churned as the realization hit her. "We opened it," she whispered. "We broke the seal when we opened that door." Michael's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking back to the road. "So, what does that mean? Can we fix it?" Sarah wasn't sure. The notebook didn't offer answers, only warnings. But one phrase stood out, written in bold letters on the final page. Asterisk, if the seal is broken, return to where it began asterisk. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, "we have to go back." He slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to the side of the road. "What? Are you serious? Did you not see what just happened back there?" "I know," Sarah said quickly. "But look at this." She pointed to the phrase. "It says we have to go back to where it started. Maybe there's a way to fix this, to stop it." Michael stared at her, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "And if we're wrong, if we go back and it kills us?" Sarah didn't have an answer. The thought terrified her, but the alternative, letting that thing remain free, growing stronger, was worse. She could see the same realization dawning on Michael. Finally, he nodded, his voice tight. "Okay, let's do it." The drive back to the house felt even longer, every mile stretching endlessly. When they arrived, The house loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding despite the bright morning sun. The oppressive feeling hit them the moment they stepped out of the car, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The basement door was still shut, but the faint whispering they'd heard before had returned, a low, menacing hum that seemed to seep through the walls. Michael grabbed a crowbar from the garage, his jaw set. "Whatever happens," he said, "we stick together." Sarah nodded, clutching the notebook tightly. Together, they descended the basement stairs. The small door was open again, the darkness beyond it deeper than ever. The room had changed once more. The glowing symbols on the floor had spread, twisting into intricate, almost hypnotic patterns. The doll was gone, replaced by something else, a dark, shifting mass in the center of the room, pulsating like a heartbeat. Sarah flipped through the notebook, her hands trembling. One page caught her eye, a sketch of a similar circle, with instructions written in shaky handwriting. "We have to draw another seal," she said, her voice barely audible. Michael nodded, already scanning the room for anything they could use. They found a piece of chalk near the stairs, its edges worn but still usable. Sarah knelt on the floor, copying the symbols from the notebook as quickly and precisely as she could. The air grew colder with every stroke, the whispering growing louder, more frantic. The shadow in the center of the room began to stir, its shape rising and twisting. It had no face, no features, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing down on them like a weight. "Hurry," Michael urged, his eyes fixed on the growing form. Sarah's hand shook as she finished the last symbol. "Done," she said, scrambling to her feet. "Now what?" The notebook didn't say. They stood there, staring at the circle, waiting for something to happen. The shadow seemed to laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. It surged forward, testing the edge of the newly drawn seal. For a moment, it seemed to recoil, but then it pushed harder, cracks appearing in the chalk lines. "It's not strong enough," Michael said, panic creeping into his voice. Desperation took hold of Sarah. She flipped to the final page of the notebook, scanning the scribbled notes for anything she'd missed. Her eyes landed on one final line, scrawled so faintly it was almost invisible. Asterisk, the watcher can only be bound by the one who broke the seal asterisk. Her blood ran cold. "It's me," she whispered. "I have to finish it." Michael grabbed her arm. "What? No, you don't even know what that means." "I don't have a choice," Sarah said, pulling away. "It's the only way." Before he could stop her, she stepped into the circle. The shadow surged toward her, its tendrils lashing out like claws. But the moment she touched the center, everything stopped. The room went silent, the oppressive weight lifting for a brief moment. Then, with a deafening roar, the shadow collapsed in on itself, disappearing into the seal. Sarah fell to her knees, gasping for air. The symbols on the floor faded, the room returning to its original empty state. Michael rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. But as they climbed the stairs, a faint whisper reached Sarah's ears, almost too soft to hear. She turned back toward the basement, her heart sinking as the sound grew louder. The seal might have been restored, but she realized with chilling certainty that the watcher wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time. And it wasn't finished with her yet. The drive away from the house was silent. Michael kept glancing at Sarah, her pale face turned toward the window as if trying to escape what had just happened. She clutched the old notebook tightly in her lap, its worn pages fluttering slightly in the breeze from the open window. Outside, the world seemed normal. Birds sang, the sun shone, but for Sarah, nothing felt right. Michael finally broke the silence. "You're sure it's over?" His voice was low, hesitant, as though speaking too loudly might undo whatever fragile balance had been restored. Sarah didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure. The seal had held for now. The oppressive feeling that had haunted the house had lifted the moment a watcher vanished, but that faint whisper she'd heard as they left still echoed in her mind. "I think so," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "At least for now." Michael sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "We need to report this. To someone. I don't even know who. Paranormal investigators. Priests." Sarah shook her head. "No one will believe us. And even if they did, what would they do? This thing, it's older than anything we understand. A few people with cameras or rituals aren't going to stop it." Michael frowned but didn't argue. He knew she was right. Whatever they have encountered was beyond human comprehension, beyond anything that could be reasoned with or exorcised. Still, the thought of leaving it alone, of letting it linger, made his skin crawl. They drove for hours, not speaking, until they reached a small diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The sign outside flickered, its neon letters barely clinging to life. They sat in a corner booth, sipping lukewarm coffee as the weight of the last few days began to settle over them. Michael studied Sarah across the table, noticing how distant she seemed, her gaze fixed on some invisible point far beyond the walls of the diner. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. She hesitated, running her fingers along the edge of the notebook. I keep thinking about that whisper," she said finally. "What if it wasn't a warning? What if it was a promise?" Michael leaned forward, his brows furrowing. "A promise. Sarah, we sealed it. You sealed it. That thing is gone." "For now," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She flipped the notebook open, revealing the last page. The scribbled phrase asterisk, "The Watcher waits for the call to break the seal" asterisk stared back at them, ominous and unyielding. "It's not destroyed, Michael. It's just trapped. And if someone else opens that door..." Michael cut her off. "Then we make sure no one does. We sell the house, tear it down if we have to, make sure no one goes near it ever again." Sarah nodded, though the pit in her stomach remained. It wasn't just about the house. She could feel it, deep in her bones. This wasn't over. The Watcher wasn't just a presence confined to a basement. It was something more, something that had seeped into her life, into her very soul. Over the next few weeks, they did everything they could to distance themselves from the house. They contacted a real estate agent, emphasizing the need for discretion, and sold it to a developer who planned to demolish it. Michael wanted to stay and oversee the process, but Sarah couldn't bear it. She insisted they leave town entirely, start fresh somewhere far away. They moved to a quiet city on the other side of the state, renting a small apartment in a building with no basements. Sarah took up painting, her canvases filled with abstract swirls and shadows that seemed to pour from her subconscious. Michael returned to his work, throwing himself into long hours at the office in an attempt to forget. For a while, life seemed almost normal. But the shadows lingered. Sarah woke up some nights to the faint sound of whispering, so soft she could barely tell if it was real or a figment of her dreams. Other times, she felt the weight of a presence in the room, invisible but undeniable. She didn't tell Michael. He was finally starting to let go of the fear, and she didn't want to drag him back into it. One evening, months after they'd left the house, Sarah was sorting through a box of old belongings when she found the notebook again. She had packed it away, intending to throw it out, but now, holding it in her hands, she couldn't bring herself to part with it. The pages seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain, as though the book itself were alive. She flipped through it, her eyes lingering on the final page. A single new line had been added, written in the same shaky handwriting. Asterisk, "You cannot run from the Watcher." Asterisk. Her breath caught, and she slammed the book shut, her heart racing. She turned toward the living room, where Michael was watching TV, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. She wanted to tell him, to show him, but what could she say? That the thing they'd escaped wasn't done with them. That it might never be. That night, she couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder now, almost tangible, filling the apartment with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. She sat in the living room, clutching the notebook, her thoughts racing. The Watcher wasn't gone. it never would be. And deep down, she realized it had never truly been confined to the house. The seal had been a distraction, a temporary solution to a problem that was far greater than she had imagined. As the first rays of dawn broke through the window, Sarah made a decision. She grabbed a pen and opened the notebook, flipping to the final page. Her hand shook as she began to write, but she didn't stop. The words flowed from her as if they were being dictated by something unseen. Asterisk, I understand now. The Watcher doesn't need a house, a seal, or a circle. It needs a witness, someone to remember, to carry its story forward, and that someone is me asterisk. When she finished, she stared at the page, her chest tight with fear, but also a strange sense of clarity. The Watcher hadn't chosen her, it had been waiting for her. And now she understood her role, not as its victim, but as its keeper. Michael found her hours later, still sitting in the same spot, the notebook clutched in her hands. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. "What's going on?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a calm he didn't recognize. "It's okay," she said, her voice steady. "I know what to do now." He didn't understand, and she didn't explain. Some things, she realized, were better left unsaid. The Watcher wasn't something that could be fought or defeated. It was a presence, a force that existed beyond human comprehension. And now it was hers to bear. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to write. She filled journal after journal with the story of the Watcher, its symbols, its whispers, its shadows. She wrote not to summon it, but to contain it, to keep its memory alive without letting it spread. And though the whispers never stopped, she found a strange peace in her new purpose. The Watcher waited, as it always had. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore.